the length of ensiling, because that does have a huge impact, especially on starch digestibility. So the longer it's ensiled, the more available and digestible that starch will be. So that certainly has a factor when it comes to the net energy for lactation for that crop.
Hello and welcome to the Dairy Podcast Show. Mark Thomas here, and we have a great opportunity today to talk about forage quality, specifically corn silage quality. We all know that quality forage is the key to making milk, and when we don't have that available, we're all faced with lots of challenges. Really can't replace great quality forage. So with that, we're really happy today to welcome Dr. Dennis Hancock and Dr. Kevin Panke-Buisse, both with the U.S. Dairy Forage Research Center, USDA. So with that, Dennis and Kevin, welcome to the Dairy Podcast Show.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Mark. Good to be here.
As usual, if you could give a bit of an overview, background of where you're from and how you got here today. Dennis, if you want to start, and that listeners a bit of a background.
Sure. So my name is Dennis Hancock. I've been the center director here at the Dairy Forage Research Center for about 4.5 years now. And prior to that, I had spent several years on the faculty at the University of Georgia as a forage extension specialist there, working a lot with both dairies and beef cattle operations on forage quality and forage production. And prior to that, I grew up on a farm in western Kentucky, and I've always had forage production kind of is ingrained in me.
Excellent. On to our next guest, a little bit of your background and an overview.
Sure, absolutely. So my name is Kevin Panke-Buisse. I grew up in southeastern Wisconsin. My family were on either side crop farmers and loggers, so pretty integral to the history of Wisconsin's agricultural industries. Always knew that I was going to end up doing some form of natural environment sciences, right? But the microbiome is the thing that is the absolute most fascinating to me. So I did most of my training during my PhD looking at the soil microbiome and how it helps plants grow. And I moved from soil into silage, really looking at the whole dairy agroecosystem and how things connect to one another microbially from soil to silo to rumen and back.
Mycotoxins are silent poisons, challenging the health and productivity of your cows. Protect your cows and your business by testing feedstuffs to know which mycotoxins are present in your environment. With that information in hand, you can work with your nutritionist to develop a management program to reduce mycotoxin impacts on your cows and your operation. To get started with your own mycotoxin control program, talk to your Diamond V representative today.
Excellent. And super relevant to our listeners because, again, unfortunately, in some cases, we're faced with a pile of forage that isn't the best forage and can't really do all too much about it, right? It's too little, too late. So, let's start back to the soil. You both have a plan. You've thought this through for our podcast today, but everyone wants to take the lead here. What are those key factors? I think our audience have been maybe even inundated with all the correct things to do, if you will, in terms of what to do at harvest and from harvest, packing and covering. But there's lots and lots of pre-harvest stuff. So let's start there.
Well, I might jump in and say that it really starts even before you go to the field for the first time in the season to plant. It starts with hybrid selection is one of the key factors in determining the quality of the corn silage that you're going to produce. Certainly agronomic management, fertility, and strategies to maximize not only the forage production, the mass, but especially the grain content. When it comes right down to it, corn silage is chiefly a way of providing digestible fiber and a lot of grain, a lot of starch. And that's really the key things to consider when it comes to corn silages. Those are your two most important responsibilities. Um, Agronomic management, of course, then kind of leads into other things like irrigation or rainfall and the timing of that. And planting time, of course, helps to uh, organize the crop around pollination and the temperatures that you may experience during pollination. That's probably one of the biggest challenges that we have across the country is the heat and the stress on the plant during pollination. That's really where a lot of grain is either made or lost during that particular point in time. I remember many times in late June or early July, my uncle, who was our primary row crop farmer, would always talk about that's $100,000 rain or something like that. You know, it was a good heavy, good rain at the well-timed event. And what he was talking about is he really made a lot of money with that rain because it was well-timed right around pollination on the corn, and the temperature being appropriate for pollination as well is very, very crucial too. So those are the kind of the preseason things that are within some of that's within our control, and a lot of it's out of our control, of course. But we can control parts of that, and to ensure that we're timing it appropriately relative to that pollination event.
So Dennis, to explore that a little bit more, because I think it's really relevant. Obviously, in certain parts of the country, I'm originally from northern New York. Well, you can't plant, or you can, but you don't want to plant for a certain date for fear of frost, etc. And over the years, we've seen that pushed, and most people win, but some get burned a bit. It's that risk reward. On the other end now, as I mentioned, I live in Torreon, Mexico. So if we're looking for heat stress, fortunately, the last week or so has been a bit mild for this time of year. But yeah, it's extreme heat stress, very dry, all irrigation. So, as you're working through, in the U.S. Forage Lab and obviously working across the country, what are just some basics of avoiding, pollination and extreme heat and so forth? I mean, keeping with traditional windows, or are there some, new considerations or recommendations, especially as we're seeing some, environmental temperatures so in certain regions?
Well, that's where it really comes into talking with your supplier of your hybrids that you're working with, because some of those have relatively short intervals between when they're planted and when they're ready to be pollinated, and that pollination event is going to occur, and others are longer. And of course, we have relative maturity, and generally we're talking about the season-long production of that too. But really working with your hybrid supplier, there's quite a bit of variability from planting until silk, and that's where coming up with a good timing based on what's your seasonal typical season to be able to hit those cooler temperatures. But especially once we get above 100 degrees or so, and really even above 95 or so, we really start running some major risk of reducing the amount of kernel set, and maybe even reducing the amount of kernel fill as it begins to fill out the rest of the season. So, yeah, there's certainly an early limit, right? That itch that only the tractor seat will scratch with regard to going out and planting. Everyone wants to get out there earlier, but unfortunately, there is a limit, of course, to what we can do there too. But what we can play around with a little bit through hybrid selection is that amount of time between planting and pollination, that first pollination event.
So I really like the thought of, pre-planting, getting those thoughts in line. And I can't but help to use the analogy a bit of really a newborn calf, what happens in the first 24 hours, or even though heat stress in utero to the cow affects that calf and that calf's calf, the offspring of that calf. And we know what happens around the time of colostrum absorption So it's I think really similar in a way is, what happens to this corn plant during critical stages that affects the end result, right? You're going to be a poor producer if these don't fit, and that's not for the plant, and that's at least in the dairy world, for the calf. So step two, we have our hybrids selected. We hopefully have an appropriate window. What's step two?
Probably agronomic management again really comes into play, ensuring you have weed-free, pest-free, disease-free situations for that crop to really hit its maximum. Of course, that's going to vary with your hybrid as well as your particular environment and crop rotation sequence as well. And if I might give a plug for really analyzing the economics behind continuous corn for corn silage, that's a real challenge, and there is some real advantage to having a really strong rotation sequence built in to there's really something magical about growing corn after alfalfa, and it's a lot of agronomics that we know about, but including some soil microbes, as Kevin can attest to,
Absolutely.
that really make a huge impact on that as well. So, but yeah, it's really checking all those boxes. Same as if a corn grower was growing that corn. We really have to chiefly maximize that grain content and starch content. And then at harvest time, our chief responsibility is not to screw it up, is to make sure we get everything that was there and maximize the availability of those nutrients down the road.
Kevin, you mentioned your PhD work in soil microbiome. What are some things around that, and just agronomic practices that have evolved to really provide the best soil for that cornplant?
Absolutely. I mean, so you can look at a lot of soil quality, a lot of soil fertility metrics. You can look at the amount of nitrogen you have, the amount of carbon you're holding on to, right? But really, for my money, it comes down to looking at how your crop performs over time, right? A lot of people talk about sustainability and the resilience of systems, and there's a few ways that you can talk about that and portion that out. But for me, it's time and practice. How long can you keep doing what you're doing, right? And maybe that's from a generational small farm kind of thinking way, but from a soil fertility standpoint, when you rotate, which is one of the simplest things that Dennis mentioned, that gain or that kind of bonus you get coming out of alfalfa, as an example, and into corn, is indispensable, right? And you need that corn silage for that dairy energy. That's absolutely true. But if you have a really good rotational scheme so that you can take advantage of the soil health benefits, right? Even if you can get a number on a piece of paper that says that your soil is this or your soil is that healthy, but the proof is in the pudding, so to speak, right? When you're seeing really good production year over year, or even just not declining production year over year in continuous corn, uh, that's a healthy soil microbiome, right? And we know that the things that we can do are really well planned rotations, or if you're in a place where it's feasible, continuous living cover or cover crops. Those kinds of things, plants are constantly putting nutrition into the soil on our behalf, really, right? And on behalf of the microbes that live there.
No, and I think a really important topic, and obviously any one of these could be a full podcast or more, or a full day of discussion of hybrid selection for that, soil quality and management. But one of our consultants, his father is a well-recognized agronomist in the area, and he talks of sincerely be worried, for the future of those producers that don't adopt some of these practices, as you just mentioned, right? They're they're stealing from the soil, and at some point, it's going to be really difficult to gain that back, right? And I'm sure we've seen that in many places of the U.S. also, but not necessarily poor practices, but not the best practices to maintain that soil health, soil quality. So I guess now we've picked the right seeds, if you will. We have a timing. We hopefully have our soil analyses and soil prepared well. Step 3, if you will.
I think step 3 there is have a really good conversation with whomever is going to be harvesting your crop, and getting your equipment, or ensuring that they have their equipment if it's a company that you're working with to custom harvest it. Getting a plan in place to really, first of all, if you're hiring it in, knowing what their practices generally are and what kind of inoculant they're going to be using, and do they have it? How do they maintain their equipment? How often do they check, for example, kernel processing? Looking at all the things that we really want to uh, make sure that we have no unforced errors when it comes to the harvesting sequence. Usually, one of the biggest bottlenecks, of course, is having enough packing tractors and whatever else to get the storage portion of that done, getting it into the bunk or drive over pile or into the bag or whatever it might be. Most folks find that they have plenty of throughput to be able to get the crop out of the field, especially if they're custom hiring it done. But usually the slow part is in the packing phase, and honestly, that's where a lot of mistakes are made. Is that we're rushed during the packing portion of that, and not really paying attention to, assuming that we've got it at the right dry matter, but then making sure that we're getting it as compact as possible, as little pore space as possible, and ensuring that we're getting 15, 16 pounds or more of dry matter per cubic foot is really our goal, to get it down below about 40% porosity. That's really the benchmark. And even tighter than that would be even better. But that's usually where things really go awry. So having a good conversation with whomever is going to be doing that phase is really an important part of that.
So, Dennis, I think you bring up some really key points that we see in certain regions where corn silage is harvested by a custom harvester and/or purchased. We have a number of producers that purchase a fair amount of their silage, and what we've been talking about quite a bit is one, getting everyone aligned, because what is the best economic practices for a custom harvester are not necessarily what we want on the dairy, right? It's less fuel consumption, move fast. Therefore, your kernel processor is maybe not tightened down to where it should be, because you're going to consume more fuel, you're going to move a little slower. But on the dairy side, those are crucial, right? And you got to see that in the field before maybe the first load that gets, and you can catch it, but you don't want to see it, once you uncover it, 6 months later. So, what can you say as you worked with producers, you worked with, dairy producers or beef producers, and then crop farmers, crop producers, some comments about aligning, showing the value, because in that case, the dairy can pay more for that forage. Yep, it's going to cost more. You're going to have to move a little slower, but this is critical for our quality. Kevin, Dennis, some thoughts on managing those conversations. And we've thought about, just even hosting a bit of a corn silage day with, agronomists and nutritionists, and okay, we need to get everybody aligned here. We want to make the same product.
A good one.
Yeah. Any thoughts there or experiences?
Kevin, you want to go first on this one?
Absolutely, yeah. I always say that your crop is never going to have more nutritive value than early evening the day it would be harvested, right? Um, Everything after that point is you working to lock in the value that's in that forage, right? So uh, we've got a dance with many partners, and not everybody has the same priorities, right? Or actually, everyone has the same priority in general, right? It's to do good, right? Um, but there's nuance there. So being able to get everyone on the same page and be able to identify the optima in that system, right? Because if you make good choices and everybody's on the same page, everybody wins. And so being able to have those conversations, understanding the consequences, good or bad, of the decisions that we make, in terms of harvest feed, kernel processing, inoculation, choice of inoculant, even how much effort you put into pile density or packing for your silage, right? All of those play this huge role, and a small miscalculation in the beginning compounds itself over time, right? And depends on the size of the bunk, but if you imagine it as a big pile of dollars, right, which is really what it represents, and then you look at 40% shrink, I don't think I'd like to see 40% of a pile of money evaporate into the air. I think that would hurt me pretty bad. Uh, we get complacent with the everydayness of these things, but it makes a big difference. The difference between 15% shrink and 40 is just a couple small choices.
And those who are at 40, do they actually know or realize they're at 40, right? I guess is the other part.
Yeah, that's often a hard time to convince them that yeah, you really did have a huge amount of shrink. I can tell you this is kind of an interesting thing for us as the federal government. The one thing that we do really well is we make some really good corn silage because when we custom hire all of our corn silage done, and we have very tight specifications about what that quality is going to mean, and coming out of the field, what does that look like? And for us, it's one of the chief factors that I have found is kernel processing score. So if we can keep that kernel processing score where we want it, plus or minus 10% on average, uh, that actually sets a cascade back of slowing the harvester down, making sure that they're adjusting it appropriately, et cetera. That's one of the main drivers. The other, of course, is moisture, and we have 3 percentage points on either side of 34. That's our range that we're trying to shoot for, and there's actually some penalties built into the contract if we get outside that range, and that makes sure that we get really good moisture so that we pack it really well as well. Now we do all the packing ourselves, so we kind of take that a bit out of the equation. But those two coming out into the field, if we can get those right, we really have gone a long way to protecting good forage quality. Then the third is making sure we got the right inoculant, a good inoculant, to take care as if nothing else as a risk management strategy. Corn salad is coming out of the field 9 times out of 10. If you're doing everything you're supposed to do and everything goes right, you're not going to have any problems with fermentation. It's when things don't go exactly right, and of course in farming, rarely does everything go exactly right, especially with weather and other types of things. So that's where inoculation can come into play, and we build that into the contract as well. Now we pay for it. We have good quality, but we pay for it. But I can tell you for a fact that we end up with some of the best corn solids around because of that factor.
Dennis, I think that's a really good point. If the USDA can set standards for bringing in a custom service provider, whatever that may be, right? There's lots of outsourcing of different services. These are requirements. Why can't a dairy do that, right? Okay, we're going to pay X for this, and this is the quality range. And I think that's something we really need to produce or push up producers to do, because again, it's critical. It's what it's going to arrive to your to your operation to feed your cattle for the next year or more in many cases. So I really like that approach. We what about, the comments of planning in there? We went from hybrid selection, if you will, to soil quality and then harvest. I think that's a great order in a way. Don't prepare, think ahead, have that all planned. Maybe before you even have it planted, you have that all in line before harvest comes, not 2 days before. But the aspects around kernel spacing and kernels per acre and so forth, all these parameters that you use, and anything new, exciting in that area.
In terms of like on the cob itself, is that what you're talking about? I guess.
But, I'm saying more on the planning side. So, we were kind of going through like your picture of hybrids,
Gotcha.
Your soil's ready. Now we're gonna that itch is ready to be scratched on the tractor seat, and you're gonna put seed in the ground. What all around that aspect.
Well, I think there is some yield advantage, at least here in the northern tier states, for twin row, narrower row spacing. 15-inch spacing has been shown to give a slight yield bump. And there has been some long-term research actually done here at the University of Wisconsin. Joe Lauer had done some really long-term trials where they were looking at the benefit of narrower spacing at higher, at a range of seeding rates, actually. I think his results would show that there is some marginal improvements because of that. The challenge, of course, is that most folks have equipment that's set up on traditional 30-inch rows, and switching over is going to require a wholesale change for many of those producers. Is it really worth it? That only that producer would really be able to say over the long run, because there are some significant costs with bringing in new steel and new equipment to be able to manage it that way. I would say that irrigation, with irrigation systems, it makes it even more valuable to do that. Now, as you go further south in the U.S., in general, that relationship falls apart a little bit more. There's less of that benefit to narrower row spacing, and the traditional 30-inch row type of setup generally has proven to be as good as anything in the alternatives. Now, that being said, seeding rate and the number of kernels per foot or whatever your metric is within the row is really a crucial factor there too. And particularly with some hybrids that have the ability to produce on average more than 2 ears per stalk, that makes a huge difference. And I do think there is some general rules of thumb that one could fall within a particular range and generally say it's going to max out around 34,000, 36,000, somewhere in that neighborhood. But above that, it's going to be really hard to see much of a yield increase. However, there does seem to be some hybrids that are even more responsive than others, and it's really hard sometimes to look at a large number of those in a university trial. It's, in my opinion, that's where on-farm research really comes into play, and working with someone who could really advise them on a real trial and not just an observation per se.
So again, I think it gets back to, like you said, working with your service providers or consultants. And, if you're looking at new equipment, for example, it's really a partial budget, right, of what you can expect based on the data and what is that investment and how long it's going to take to pay for that investment, given average conditions, if you will. No, excellent. So let's continue. We're on this path here. Dennis, you mentioned, 7 factors. Kevin, what's our next step here? We've got our harvesters. Either we're going to do it on our own, so we're going to take responsibility. Our plant is growing now. Next steps.
Well, I mean, from my perspective, right, once we're putting up a crop, choice of inoculant is important. As Dennis mentioned, 9 times out of 10 with corn silage, you could choose not to inoculate. There are a ton of lactic acid bacteria living on the surface of that crop, and they will very happily ensile that for us, right? That's how we did it before we had access to inoculants. But with the scale of many people's operations and what hangs in the balance, right? Leaving it to chance, right? That 1 out of 10 hangs like a sword of Damocles. So, uh, particularly with the weather challenges that we've been talking about, differences in climate, right? We not only have silage inoculation as a potential, I'll think of it like an insurance policy, I guess, for when things are marginal, right? You see a silage inoculation come through in the final product quality when conditions weren't ideal. So in that case, your choice is important. And it's balanced, right? So when you're making a silage, we're essentially trading sugar in the forage to these microbes in exchange for acid that pickles it, that ferments it or preserves it for us, gets that pH down. So some of these big management choices that we're making, that Dennis mentioned, um, they're setting this crop up to be more ensilable, right? We're teeing it up for these microbes to do their job the best they can. When we put together a big nutritious crop, that's a lot of water soluble carbohydrates that we can use to get that pH down quickly. When we pack it in the bunk real tight, we reduce that porosity and we exclude that oxygen. That's setting us up to just immediately move right into that anaerobic fermentation that gives us the acid we need. But the acid that's being produced in that silo is also important, because you can bring that pH down really, really quickly. A lot of first generations inoculants used lactic acid alone. They would use what's sometimes referred to as a homofermentative lactic acid bacteria. Those are really efficient. Lactic acid is not volatile, so you don't lose it from the silo. It's produced, it stays in place. The problem, though, is that once you go to feed it, you crack open that silo and it's re-exposed to oxygen. There's all sorts of other microbes that love to eat lactic acid, right? And as they're consuming it, your pH is coming back up. You'll see heating, you'll see things like that, right? That's where your aerobic stability or aerobic deterioration really comes into play, right? And our big players from a fermentation standpoint that really prevent that are going to be acetic acid, which is the biggest one, and playing less of a role but still helpful is propionic acid when we're talking about corn silage. So those in concert work really well, right? And that's where we've seen the rise of the use of Lactobacillus buchneri. It's pretty handily efficient, right? It's we're not losing as much with buchneri to CO2 or to shrink in order to produce the acetic acid that gives us the preservation that we need to make sure that that crop that we put all of these management decisions and work into, that we're not seeing that shrink or leave via the air. Make sure it gets into the animal, gets into the milk, and eventually onto the truck.
So then, again, any one of these topics, we could spend plenty of hours on inoculants and inoculant use. I guess, just really quickly from the logistics, you're going to work with your consultants, providers to pick the right inoculant, hopefully. But a little bit about application. I see in some places that's being applied by, honestly, a person with a backpack sprayer spraying some liquid on top of the pile. We could talk about the danger of that, obviously, right? That that person potentially is at some risk as they're walking around with a packing tractor there. But what is that really providing? I mean, well, where's the best place to get an inoculant? At the harvester, in the field, when it's unloaded, etc. Because I often see, we feel good because we have this inoculant, we've purchased it, we're applying it, but our application process is not allowing for the best use. You might as well not use anything, or maybe not. Some comments there.
No, I mean that's an excellent set of questions. Ultimately, I think people are limited by what works for their system, right? Individual producers are going to have individual needs, and for my money, putting a dry inoculant onto the harvester or the chopper, that makes a lot of sense, right? It keeps the inoculant in contact with the forage for the longest period of time. But at the same time, in order to get those benefits of protection or probability that we discussed, sometimes it's necessary to make a different choice, right? At the same time, I think that when we're asking questions about inoculation and whether or not it's actually effective, right? I spent this money on this much inoculant. Was that really worth it? How do I see it? Testing is useful. Data. I mean, I'm speaking as a data scientist, right? So I'm a little biased, but being able to go back and look at changes over time or what impact a choice had, you're only going to be able to do that if you have the data to back it up and to look at that, right? So fermentation analysis can be a really, really useful tool in the management toolbox.
No, I think that's a great comment, right? And in many cases, and I think you'll concur, is that, we just need to use the data that's available, because if we're going to look at year over year, well, different hybrids, different weather conditions, different soil conditions, different fields, can we really compare that this was better because we used this inoculant when you have all those other variables? So, like many things we do on the dairy, there is good research that this product works or works within this range. Well, then we have to trust that. It's going to be really tough to do a inoculant trial on a commercial dairy, I would imagine, right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely a great point. And, I certainly agree with what Kevin was saying. The proof is in the pudding, right? And what data comes out of that. But there are recommendations that come along, and there's every one of those products has a recommendation on how to apply it. And I think it's really important for everyone to always follow those instructions. Most of the time that is going to be on the chopper, but after 25, 30 years of seeing people apply inoculants, I've seen just about everything. And in some ways works really well, and some you might as well just be watering it down or something. It's not going to benefit. And that's true whether we're talking about a dry inoculant or a liquid inoculant or anything else. And by the way, one of the more common problems that I've seen with liquid inoculants is when they go to mix it up, that they use water right out of the faucet.
Chlorinated water. Yes.
You've just killed it all. So, you got to make sure you're using distilled water or well water, something like that, that's not going to result in damaging the product. The other one would be heat, of having it too hot in a place where it gets hot on the chopper or something like that, avoiding getting your inoculant too hot.
Absolutely. We had a fridge go down 1 year. I don't know if that was before your time or not, Dennis, but the inoculant fridge died and no one noticed for quite a while. So that was a bad year.
Those are really, really great comments, because with all that we do, right, it's back to the basics. This doesn't work, or we have an outbreak in calves, and generally it's not some new bug that's causing an issue. It's just, was the colostrum pasteurized correctly? What about hygiene and so forth? So I think you're just getting to basic things. Is the refrigerator temperature stable, right? And or is there chlorine in the water? And I really like that approach. Don't forget the basics, right? Um, so Dennis, have we, as we kind of start to wrap up here a little bit, lots of good stuff. And again, any one of these topics could be a podcast in itself, let alone a 3-day corn silage quality course. I don't think we got through all 7 of the key factors, did we? So, but let's go ahead. Which ones have we missed?
The only one that we missed off of my 7 that I preach about is the length of ensiling, because that does have a huge impact, especially on starch digestibility. So the longer it's ensiled, the more available and digestible that starch will be. So that certainly has a factor when it comes to the net energy for lactation for that crop. It's interesting. I was looking the other day because we're getting ready for the World Dairy Expo and the World Forage Analysis Super Bowl, and so I was kind of comparing out of the nutrient requirements for dairy cattle tables. I was comparing what corn silage in there as the book value, how that compares to those World Forage Analysis Super Bowl samples, and the book value for NDFD, for example, is 52%. Um, Frankly, we need to be doing much better than that on corn silage, and that was for a 48-hour. The World Forage Analysis Super Bowl, when they analyze it, they do it on a 30-hour NDF, and they're looking pretty consistently in the 70s for NDFD. So we're talking about some real rocket fuel corn silage in those situations. So it's really about minding all of those factors and really making sure that you've got a really good corn silage and taking good care of it with an inoculant. One other factor that I always joke with producers about is the fact that they will try to cut corners when it comes to the type of cover that they use. And it's like buying a Ferrari and parking it down on the street here in Madison and just expecting that you don't put a cover over it, you're going to have a mess. And you've got to really protect that crop. You've put so much into it. Really invest in a good quality cover. Not, by the way, not just on the top, but on the sidewalls in a bunk or something like that, or in the bag silage technology. Make sure you're using a really good quality bag as well. So
and then the feed out, right? And look at how many times you arrive to a dairy and you look at that face. It's either a face you want to take a picture of and use in your presentations, or it's a face that you just want to close your eyes.
Exactly.
Nothing, absolutely nothing, will spoil a crop worse than water infiltration. It is, if water can get in, air can get in, number one. And number two, all that water percolates, takes all your goodness and concentrates it at the bottom, right? So if you have a system in which effluent can leave, you just lost the best parts of your forage in the first place. And two, if things weren't looking good, those are the types of situations, those really wet springs, poor cover, where we start to see issues with botulism, which is not terribly common, but it doesn't need to be debilitating to an operation.
Going back to, if I could just briefly on the face management, that is so crucial. And I think one of the most common things that I see done wrong is not feeding out at a fast enough rate. They built their silo, whatever form that is, drive over pile or bunker or whatever, and it's way too wide, and they're feeding at a way too low of a rate. At a minimum, it needs to be 6 inches a day off that face, and really needs to be something more, up to about 12 inches, so that you're consistently getting the tip top quality of that. Not something that's been sitting out and exposed to oxygen for 24, 48 hours and begun to really deteriorate. That really is an important part of silage management is face management. and getting a good shaver or a good strategy for making sure that you're keeping that face as perpendicular as possible, the least amount of surface area exposed to oxygen as possible, and feeding it out at a rate that you aren't getting a lot of oxygen intrusion into that pack.
Absolutely. And if you're looking at the math on that, right, oxygen isn't just stopping 6 inches from the face, right? It's penetrating 8 to 12 feet, depending on your density, into that pile, right? So at a feed out rate of 6 inches a day, by the time you get 12 feet back, right, that has 24 days of at least some amount of oxygen exposure. So bags mitigate that a lot, given that you're removing much more in linear feet. But, that's oxygen exposure, the same way that it would be at the bunk, right? So just something to think about, and another reason to really nail your aerobic stability.
Beta carotene impacts reproductive performance in cattle. Because the main sources of beta carotene are forages, most cattle don't get enough. Victus Transition from DSM Firmenich contains a blend of beta carotene and mixed tocopherols, which provide needed vitamin A and antioxidants. Victus Transition fed cattle have better fertility rates and improved colostrum quality. Make sure your cattle get the beta carotene they need with Victus Transition. Visit dsm.com/Victus Transition.
So Kevin, again, back to the basics, right? And then Dennis, your comment about, how long it needs to ferment. It was just last week, I think, a producer asked me again, and then this gets back way, way before even hybrid selection, inventory management. Can we open the pile in 3 weeks? I said, you can open the pile tomorrow and start feeding it. It's going to be a very different product. And I've seen some disasters with green corn, but I said, if you don't have forage and you need to feed it, I guess you feed it. But no, it should be months, 2 months minimum. I don't know, is always my rule of thumb, but far longer could be better. So again, inventory management and not just planning the size of your bunk and feed out, but how much crop do you actually have to feed, right?
Absolutely. And yeah, you don't want to keep it forever, of course, but the longer that you can keep it, if you can kind of average, between 12 and 16 months ensiled, that's really awesome. I mean, that really is going to come out being really ready to feed, assuming, of course, that you've kept a good cover and you've got a good inoculant and you've got stability there. But if you're dealing with a scenario where you're doing it just 3 or 4 weeks after you've put it up, it hasn't had enough time to really ferment and provide those organic acids to keep it stable. So if you open it up, you better be prepared to eat the whole thing, and or else you're going to have a lot of spoilage.
I mean, it's a perishable food stuff, right? Maybe it's not a helpful analogy, but I think of it like barbecue, right? You open it early, it's still pretty good. You can eat it, but why short yourself?
Well,
Just for unless I guess, and you absolutely need to, but you don't have even a remotely mature product until 60 to 90 days minimum, depending on your microbial mix that you have going on in there, and then it's that low and slow period after that that gets you those NDFD gains.
That's an excellent comment, Karen. Yeah, I think hopefully a lot of our listeners are putting that right there. I also can't help but chuckle, Dennis, when you say, you don't want it forever. I've seen some of those cases where, well, gee, that's corn silage from, 6 years ago that we haven't gotten to yet. The funniest story, just quick, is a smaller dairy producer in Lewis County, New York. And I remember, asking to throw down some hay for some sick cow or whatever we were treating. And they threw down something that, looked like, I don't know what it was from. And he's like, yeah, we've gotten to that end of the hay mound, and Bobby has never seen the wall of the hay mound up there. And Bobby was like 45, right? Literally. So, and I remember saying, oh, why don't you just go pick some grass? I don't know. Yeah, you literally have 45-year-old hay you're feeding. So just a funny story, but I can't help remember that. Yeah, it looked like 45-year-old hay.
Find a horse to give that to. Let's save that for the horses and give the good stuff to the cows.
Cows, man. Well, they were milking about like they were getting 45-year-old hay. So, gentlemen, real pleasure. Again, I feel like we're shorting both of you and shorting the audience, but for a Friday afternoon, probably Kevin is thinking barbecue. So
You're right.
I see what's on his mind, and Dennis, I'm sure Madison this time of year is an amazing place. I have lots of good friends there, and I've been there, so I'm sure there's plenty of weekend things on the plate with family and friends that Wisconsiners are going to want to take advantage of before November and later weather comes.
It's time for our famous three. Elevate animal performance with Berg & Schmidt Animal Nutrition, your trusted ally in excellence. Their high-quality feed ingredients like coated nutrients and fat powders provide ruminants with extra energy, boosting health, productivity, and cost efficiency. Unleash your herd's potential with Berg & Schmidt.
As we wrap up here, quickly, what are some go-to references, books, online journals, what have you, for the dairy folks?
So from my perspective, my go-to always, when I came into this position, I was all about soil and plants. I didn't know much about silage except that we fed it on the farm, right? So uh, Silage Science and Technology, it's part of the Agronomy Monographs series. It's a book that has everything you could ever want to know about silage, microbiology, nutrition. It is an absolute wealth of knowledge. It's a dense read, but I have referenced it many, many times, probably on at least a monthly basis. And when I started, it was 2-3 times daily.
So for those of you who are really want to get into the nitty gritty of the basics, that sounds like a great opportunity.
Nerd out on silage.
Nerd out on silage. Excellent. And Dennis?
Well, mine's probably still going to be the nutrient requirements of dairy cattle. That's one that has a lot of great information. They recently updated it as well. In the 2021 version was updated after 20 years, and they did a complete revision. This wasn't just like going through and making some edits. They started basically from scratch on it and totally redid it. And so it's really the state of the knowledge of dairy nutrition, and I highly recommend it. It's got a wealth of information. Again, it's a bit of a dense read, but certainly for folks who are really trying to get a competitive edge, especially on nutrition, it can really help a lot. So
I would agree. I think an amazing reference, right? It's dense, but there's lots of great stuff there. Maybe it's not something you just sit down and read, but you strategically have as a reference. So I would back up that one. Something on the non-dairy side that may be a bit relevant. I'll just say a few podcasts ago, someone mentioned, actually it was some colleagues from Cargill, Diamond V, Getting Naked, Naked Consulting, really relevant, just really cool. A lot of the things that I hope we do within our group, but being transparent and really asking questions, sometimes the stupid questions. So anything that you guys have come across lately to share with our listeners?
Kevin, you got anything?
No, sorry, I'm stuck on that name. That's fantastic.
Well, you got to be careful if you Google it. Some other things you might imagine. So Patrick Lencioni. But yeah, if you don't put the author, you will get a variety. A few friends of mine said, "Which book are you reading?" So,
I'm not doing that on my work computer.
Yeah, we probably can't do that on a federal work computer. But I'll share one that I've been reading recently. Actually, it's a kind of a whole series, and I just recently discovered that the great courses are on some of the podcast platforms and audiobook platforms. And so I've been diving into some of the great courses. I have this kind of interest in personal finance, and so and estate planning and things like that. I know that's very weird, but honestly, I think if dairy farmers took a lot more interest in estate planning, we'd have a lot fewer problems. Anyway, I highly recommend those the great courses off of on a number of different audiobook platforms.
The great courses. Okay. Excellent.
That's a
Excellent.
good one. I do have one now that I've gotten over that consulting name. Uh, so I mean, for me, microbiology is a toolbox that I take everywhere, right? Regardless of discipline. So it's not just dairy; it touches our lives, right? I had the great pleasure to work with someone who did a lot of human microbiome work um, when I lived in New York. Uh, but there is a really good book on the topic called I Contain Multitudes. And if you are at all interested in the microbiome or the fact that, humans are only 10% human by, by cell count, uh, then it's a pretty good one to read, right? We are far more microbe than we are person, and we all work together to make life work, and it is pretty neat.
That sounds pretty cool. I just Googled it quick here. Sorry, multitasking, but
No, that's a safe Google.
yes, the microbes within us. So cool. And you guys, I think I know the answer. What sets aside that progressive producer, someone who's going to be within the industry? I don't want to speak for you, but it's probably those who can produce really, really great forage corn silage. But I'll let you answer.
I mean, it's not so specific as that for me, right? It's taking a long lens. I come from the school of land stewardship of Buckminster Fuller and Wendell Berry, right? We are partners uh, with the land, and uh, if we're not working together, we're not working. Not for long anyway, right? So taking that long lens and looking at things as time and practice. How long can I do this? Can I pass this down to my kids or my grandkids?
Great. I like that, Kevin. Yeah, super, super appropriate. No matter where you may be on the earth. Dennis?
Well, it's hard to top that one, but one that I really think about are people of vision. Those who can take a look at um, a scenario or a situation and see the opportunity that's there rather than just the litany of challenges. I've been very lucky in my career to have had interactions with a number of those types of producers who can see an opportunity in a field or in a market opportunity that they see that no one else really saw, and be able to turn that into um, a very profitable enterprise that's not only good for them and their farm enterprise, but also for their family and things like that. So people of vision, that's who I aspire to be, and who inspire me whenever I'm around people of vision.
And likewise, yeah, you talked about different technologies we have. And, if it's not for those people that have vision, we still be doing lots of stuff like we did many, many years ago, right? So I think always relevant. With that, Kevin, Dennis, thanks. A little bit of longer podcast, but with two of you here and a huge range of discussions in the topic, I think more than appropriate as we wrap up this Friday afternoon. So to our listeners, keep in mind the sponsors of the Dairy Podcast Show who make this possible. And with that, thank you, Kevin and Dennis, and Mark Thomas here, signing off for the weekend. Take care.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Thank you.